she is.
Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. A lot of you are coming out very late, so I'll try not to bore you. I'll try not to make you fall asleep. Um, like Sam said, this talk is going to be a queer reading of Blade Runner. This has been my favorite film since I was 16. So we've been through it together. I've done a lot of analysis on this film since then, but a queer reading is kind of new territory for me. So I'm very excited to kind of test drive my ideas and share with y'all. See what's up. Making sure. Okay. So for those of you who have either not seen the film or it's been a while since you've seen it, just want to go through a very quick little rundown of what it's about. Directed by Ridley Scott, came out in 1982. So not too long after he did Alien, but it follows Harrison Ford as Rick Deckard, who is our titular Blade Runner, which is the film's vocabulary. It just means he's a cross between a detective and a bounty hunter. And he is living in this very dystopian, destroyed version of Los Angeles. The film takes place in 2019, but 2019 as predicted by the 80s. So they got some stuff right, they got some stuff wrong. We still don't have flying cars yet. But Deckard has been tasked with hunting down, the film uses the word retiring for the euphemism of it all, but he's being asked to hunt down and kill 4 escaped androids, replicants. So the replicants were manufactured by the Tyrell Corporation to be used as slave labor off-world. Most of the population has left Earth because it's been so damaged. But 4 of the replicants, who are led by Roy, and Roy's the character we're going to be focusing on primarily during this talk. Roy is their leader. He hijacked a shuttle that was going back down to Earth. So he's one to watch out for. He's originally set up to be kind of the antagonist, the villain, the monster of the story, if you will. But Ridley Scott is definitely more subversive than that. There's never there's never a clear good evil binary in this film, which is one of the things I love most about it. Speaking of binaries, right, this idea that Blade Runner can be read through a queer lens, this kind of queer allegory planted on the idea of being a replicant. There are not too many queer readings of the film yet, not that in official academic circles. There's certainly a lot of talk about it in like social media and blog posts, but one of the scholars that I looked at was this guy, Scott B. Cotman, who is a film scholar at, I believe, Stanford. And he described Roy, especially in his relationship to Deckard, as, quote, a homophobic nightmare, unquote. And you can kind of sort of see why. Here's Roy when he's confronting Deckard. As you can see, Roy is not wearing too much aside from a very tight pair of shorts and also a pair of shoes. But there's a lot of attention drawn to his body, right? This uncanny android body that is in the process of breaking down. The replicants have only been given 4 years to live. The Tyrell Corporation programmed obsolescence into them for fear that the androids would become too human and start kind of developing their own emotions and their own opinions. So there's this focus on this uncanny body, this deviant body, this non-normative body. On top of that, there are a lot of literary allusions kind of hoisted upon Roy to all sorts of various monsters throughout the literary canon. Obviously, we're dealing with artificial intelligence, so the Frankenstein comparisons are very apt. With Frankenstein, the creature compares himself to Satan. So there's a lot of, kind of fallen angel / demonic imagery surrounding Roy. And a lot of these are spoken by the character himself. Roy is willingly kind of embracing his monsterhood. He behaves very much like a classic movie monster when he finally meets Deckard in the climax of the film and he's, chasing him around. He's howling like a werewolf. He's just kind of having a good old chaotic time, being intentionally creepy and unsettling. So the question here is, what is Ridley Scott doing with this characterization, right? Because obviously, this film was made in the 80s, a very queer-phobic decade, a lot of focus on queer bodies behaving in a kind of deviant, non-normative fashion. So is this what Ridley Scott is doing? Is he kind of creating this queer-coded villain? Or is he doing something a little bit more subversive, right? Especially with these literary references. We're meant to have sympathy for Frankenstein's monster. We're meant to even have sympathy for the devil, right? So I think to answer this question of what is Ridley Scott, and also what's Rutger Hauer, right? Because he had a lot of control over the creation of this character. What are these guys up to? And I personally believe, first of all, your mileage may vary, right? Because it's art, but I personally believe the answer lies in genre. So Blade Runner, very famously is this hybrid. It's this mishmash of a lot of different ideas. Obviously, it's a pioneer of cyberpunk, which we'll see in later films like The Matrix and in lots of anime that follows it. Like I said, with Roy, there's a lot of nods and allusions to Gothic figures and to Romantic era figures. And then with Deckard, right, his storyline, which we begin with, is very much responding to and working with the tropes of noir. So we have Deckard here, Harrison Ford looking very tired in his big old trench coat. And then on the right, we have Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade, who is the, protagonist of The Maltese Falcon, which is a classic example of noir. So I think, that horror, the Gothic, and noir work very well together because both genres, I think, are interested in, I guess, deviancy, in monstrous behavior, but they're more interested, if they take a more conservative bent, they're more interested in kind of containing the deviant element, in kind of figuring out what's going on with it and getting rid of it in some way. But also from a more cinematic perspective, from a visuals perspective, noir takes its cues from German Expressionism, right? So this is a genre that is born out of World War I, kind of responding artistically, visually to the traumas of war. So we have, such classic films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, and one of the kind of hallmarks, trademarks of the genre is this chiaroscuro lighting, this very intense contrast between light and dark. This, kind of iconic shot of Count Orlok coming up the stairs in Nosferatu really exemplifies that. That carries over into noir, right? This genre is born out of, the angst and the cynicism that comes from World War II. So much like German Expressionism, it is born out of war. And we continue with this heavy contrast between light and shadow in the lighting. So here's Bogart again, looking off into the distance. Something's caught his eye, but we see, the shadows on the wall behind him. This shot is from Double Indemnity, another classic noir. Our characters talking, with the femme fatale character. And we have our trademark lighting, and then that carries on into neo-noir, which again is also born out of a different kind of war. This time it's Vietnam, in the mid 70s, right, is when the genre really takes off with films like Chinatown and Taxi Driver. There is much more of an anti-authority, anti-government bent because things were not too great in the 70s with the, war and also with the economic recession. So there's a lot of just mistrust in general. And the, free love movement of the 60s had died off. So now we're just kind of left with all of these cynical feelings. But we have, Deckard here, his silhouette. He's getting ready to hunt down Roy, who was on the other side of the wall. And we have this, again, we have this contrast between light and shadow. And what this lighting does, I think, well, first of all, it's really good at establishing mood, right? It's very hard to pin down noir as a genre because it can be so many things and it can take so many forms. Most people describe it as kind of like a mood or an atmosphere. And the lighting really contributes to this sense of we can't really trust our surroundings. We can't trust the people we interact with, even if we think they are friends, they might still betray us. We can't even trust ourselves, right? This very heavy, cynical, depressing feeling, which is very, very prevalent in Blade Runner, right? We have this cityscape, which is very heavily broken up into haves and have-nots. When Deckard, is taking this job, he's a little bit hesitant at first. He's burned out. He doesn't want to do it. His supervisor reminds him, the score, pal. If you're not cop, you're little people. So it's about who has power and who doesn't have power, establishing these binaries. So so Deckard, his point of view takes up pretty much the first half of the film, roughly, and it's obviously very entrenched in this noir mood. He's a detective, right? Very old school, but Ridley Scott is using this character, I believe, to kind of criticize these classic noir tropes and how they relate, especially to gendered expectations. Noir detectives behave in a very kind of conservatively masculine fashion, where they have to be constantly stoic and buttoned up and not share anything. And I think casting Harrison Ford was a really good decision for a couple of reasons. One is because no one can play burnt out like Harrison Ford can, right? He so clearly did not want to be in this movie. And it's hard to tell how much of that is performance and how much of that is just Harrison Ford. But I think the other reason is that, you know, people had seen him first as Han Solo in Star Wars and then as Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he's playing these, you know, anti-heroic figures, but they're still very much likable. These are family-friendly movies. He's good at playing kind of scoundrels, roguish figures. And Blade Runner kind of deconstructs that image of him. He's going from, you know, likable scoundrel to a very unlikable cop. And the fact that his character Deckard is a cop cannot be understated, right? Because here's where we're deviating from noir a little bit. Most noir detectives are private eyes, right? Sam Spade is a private eye. He has his own business. He works for himself. And usually in noir, you know, your private eye figure would have a confrontation with the cops at least once, and they would butt heads a lot because they don't get along. But in this case, Deckard is working for the LAPD, and the LAPD is directly connected to the Tyrell Corporation, this hyper-capitalist monstrosity of an industry. In this picture, you know, we have Leon, who is one of the rebel replicants. He's sitting for this empathy test, this Voight-Kampff test, which is meant to, you know, police his identity, to see, you know, which side of the binary is he on? Is he on the human side or is he on the android side? And as you can see, you know, he's in the station and the chair he's sitting in is emblazoned with this Tyrell Corporation logo. So, you know, capitalism and Tyrell's kind of tyrannical rule over the city and also over the off-world colonies, this is the real villain here, this policing of non-normative identities and this strict enforcing of the binary. And Deckard, you know, as a policeman, has been asked to take part in this. So while we're talking kind of about, you know, the policing of identities, we have these replicants, you know, who have willingly risked their lives to go down into the city. It's still better than, you know, forced slavery, but they also still have to be sure that they are performing humanity correctly, right? Because there are these Blade Runners coming after them who are, you know, who have these empathy tests, who are more than willing to shoot to kill any kind of non-normative figure. In the case of Rachael, who was an interesting, you know, kind of little character study here, Rachael is a replicant, but she doesn't know it. Tyrell knows it, and later Deckard will know it, but they know it before Rachael does, sorry. So Tyrell asks Deckard to do a Voight-Kampff test on her, and at one point Deckard is asking her a question along the lines of, you know, your husband brings home a picture of a nude woman, he puts it on the wall, he's trying to get some kind of emotional reaction out of her. And she just kind of looks at him and very coolly asks, is this testing whether I'm a replicant or a lesbian, Mr. Deckard? And it's a weird line, you know, it could be seen as almost like a moment of levity in an otherwise very dark film. But I think more importantly, what is going on here is Rachael is drawing this parallel between replicants and queerness. She's basically saying, if you're not going to be able to get me for being a replicant, you might be able to get me for being queer, right? Deckard is on the hunt for some kind of deviant behavior, and it really doesn't matter what it is. So I think that we can kind of think of Rachael as our first, I suppose, queer-coded replicant figure. She's certainly the first replicant that we see, you know, more like most of in the film. So with this kind of reading, you know, so now both Deckard and Tyrell know that she is a replicant. Rachael follows Deckard home and is asking him questions about the test. And then Deckard brings up this memory that she has, that he knows she has. And he informs her very callously that they're implants. He says, those aren't your memories, they're somebody else's. They're Tyrell's nieces, right? So these were the memories of a real person that were implanted into her. And this is devastating, right? This is a huge blow. Rachael spends most of the film in this kind of existential crisis, right? Because everything she thought she knew is actually no longer the case, right? And if we want to view this through a queer lens, we can see this as Deckard basically outing Rachael before she's able to come to terms with her identity herself, right? Tyrell and Deckard, they don't have to worry about this, right? They are both controlling men. They are in positions of power. They're both ostensibly straight. And neither of them, Deckard especially, just has no empathy for the kind of anxiety that he has put Rachael through, because now that she knows she's a replicant, the city has become a whole lot more, it's become a whole lot more unsafe for her. And this is kind of where we start seeing this theme of you know, the Voight-Kampff tests are meant to kind of police the amount of humanity that someone possesses. But we're starting to see the kind of irony that's happening here, that, you know, Deckard, as the human administering these tests, really does not care at all about those he puts the test on, those who kind of go under the test. So thinking about Rachael kind of within a noir lens, right? Visually, she's kind of evoking this figure of the femme fatale. So that's, you know, a very common term in noir. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but it's this, you know, very hypersexualized figure. Her sexuality is her power. She uses it to kind of navigate her way through this very masculine landscape. And most importantly, she serves as this kind of forbidden desire for your noir detective. There's an element of transgression here, especially if we consider Rachael as this queer-coded figure, right? Because Deckard is still attracted to her despite her replicant status. But especially in his line of work, right? He knows that a human replicant relationship would be transgressive, queer-coded, shall we say. So Rachael is kind of a femme fatale in that regard, but the reading falls a little bit short, right? Because Rachael does not have the same kind of agency as a femme fatale. Deckard holds far more power over her than she does over him. He's always finding ways to dehumanize her, to remind her of where she stands. Brief little content warning for kind of talking about, you know, unhealthy relationships and a little bit of harassment. So if you want to mute your screen, if you want to just get up and stretch, I will not be offended by that at all. But Rachael keeps coming back to Deckard, keeps asking him questions, and it eventually culminates in Deckard essentially forcing himself onto Rachael, making her kiss him and tell him that she loves him, right? It's all very problematic and it's all very gross, and it's intentionally so. Right, we can read this as a human kind of teaching replicant how to be in a relationship, whatever that means. He's very much taking advantage of Rachael's naivete, and he's not being empathetic towards her and her struggle at all. Worse still, if we read this through a queer lens, this could be seen as Deckard as a very straight hetero guy forcing a straight hetero relationship on a queer figure who either does not want it or is simply not ready for it. Rachael has just come to terms with her own identity as a replicant. She doesn't really know what she wants. She's still figuring herself out. So, I mean, this kind of trope, right, of men kind of having their way is very common in noir, right? It's a way to show dominance. But I think what Ridley Scott is trying to do here is he's very much critiquing this kind of masculinity. And he's critiquing Deckard's enforcing of binaries, whether it's male female, whether it's, you know, human replicant, straight queer, what have you. You know, he did direct Alien, right? Feminist masterpiece. What did you expect? And through, you know, Deckard's characterization, like I've said, he's demonstrating the great irony of this film, which is that the human characters just don't have empathy for the android characters, and the android characters, who are said to have no empathy at all, are very caring and they're very emotional, especially towards each other. There is a reading that some people do put stock in where they think Deckard himself is a replicant. At the end of the film, he comes across this origami unicorn. Earlier in the film, he had been daydreaming about a unicorn. Oh, how did they know? Maybe they implanted the memory of the unicorn. I don't put a lot of faith in that. I don't put a lot of stock in that. I think it kind of messes with the reading of, who has empathy and who doesn't. And it's really showing here that everyone is really suffering under capitalism, right? And the policing of identities and the policing of binaries. Because Deckard, in this hyper-capitalist landscape, the only thing he has going for him is his job, right? His job becomes his identity. His identity is policeman. His identity is detective. It's enforcer, right? And he has no way to grow from that. No one is giving him the opportunity to break free from that. Until now. Enter Roy, right, who is Deckard's foil and who is just truly a force to be reckoned with. Not everybody knew what to do with Roy, I think. He brought a very different kind of energy to the film that is not traditionally noir. So we have, a couple of different film critics saying that Roy, he's intense, he's overscaled, he's overdone. He's a flamboyant romantic terrorist dandy, right? A lot of big adjectives here. What I want to focus on specifically, though, Pauline Kael's characterization of Roy as a fete, and also Rydian Davis's claim that Roy is the one figure you don't easily find in noir. I think he's half right. I think the part where he's maybe a little bit wrong, I guess, is when thinking about how noir villains are usually characterized, especially in these older films, right? Noir, because it comes about in the 40s, we're still very much in the Hays Code era. A lot of moralizing, a lot of crime doesn't pay. We can't sympathize with our villains. We should not be made to sympathize with our villains, which is very hard to do, right? Sometimes it's fun to be the bad guy, and sometimes it's fun to sympathize with the bad guy. But the question of how do we make villains that no one is going to want to emulate or have sympathy for, in the 40s, unfortunately, the answer was we make these characters queer-coded, right? Not actively queer, not openly, but we certainly provide these undertones. So I'm about to show a clip. Just wanted to make sure, I'm not sure how to do this. Do I need to wait?
No, just start the clip.
Okay, so this clip is from The Maltese Falcon. I know I mentioned Sam Spade a couple of times. The film is following, Spade, and then he's meeting with this very eccentric collector, explorer named Caspar Gutman, and he is played by Sidney Greenstreet, who actually was mentioned in this one criticism of Roy's character. There's a comparison here. So I'm just going to play about a minute of this clip, and you will definitely get a sense of the queer coding going on here. So y'all probably get the so we see that, Sam Spade is very buttoned up. He doesn't say a whole lot, whereas Sidney Greenstreet as Caspar Gutman is very large, both kind of in physicality and in energy. He takes up a lot of space. He has presence. And all of this kind of points to his queer coding, his inability to perform masculinity in the same way that Spade does. Thankfully, the queer coding of villains has kind of taken a bit of a downturn. We're not really doing this as much, given that queerness has become more accepted in society. But I mean, we still have examples as recent as Heath Ledger's Joker from The Dark Knight, which is very steeped in noir tropes, right? Batman is our black-clad, emotionally guarded and repressed hero. Heath Ledger is playing this very colorful, flamboyant, theatrical villain who is, if he's not outright in love with Batman, he's certainly infatuated with some aspect of Batman, and we're meant to kind of see this relationship as perverse, something that should not be allowed to continue. For a more kind of almost like insidious example, I'm sure most of us have grown up with Disney films. I know I have. And there's a lot of queer coding inherent in those as well. But I love this kind of meme image, because first of all, it's just funny. But second of all, I think they're kind of reclaiming queer monsterhood and queer villainy. And I do believe that is what Ridley Scott kind of wants to do with Roy. He's not just creating this standard queer-coded noir villain. He's doing something a little bit more subversive. I'm very much a disciple, of Guillermo del Toro. I love all of his films, and I love his philosophy on monsters and what monsters can be capable of. I think at their most radical, at their most revolutionary, monsters are here to kind of show us how to have empathy for those who are unlike us. And because they are on the outside, they are able to look into our society and point out all of the problems with it. They are movers and shakers and agents of change, and I think Roy is very much in this wheelhouse. The film definitely has two parts. There are two very clear parts. The first part is very much Deckard's, and I think the second part is very much Roy's. And that's when the mood kind of shifts from something a little bit less noir and a little bit more gothic, a little bit more Paradise Lost, if you will. Like I said, there are a lot of allusions, to Frankenstein, right? With this artificial intelligence who is very much at odds with his creator. The creature, in that novel wants to, he thinks that he's Adam at first, but then, he realizes that he feels more kinship with Satan after being cast out by his creator, which is very much kind of where Roy is as well. When he does finally get his audience with Tyrell, Tyrell is very kind of congratulatory, but not in a way that affirms Roy's humanity. It's more in a sense of, look at what a good job I did building this super strong, super smart robot. And there's no empathy for Roy and his desire for more life. So Roy, who is, queer like the devil is queer, he kisses Tyrell and then promptly stabs his thumbs into Tyrell's eye sockets and just straight up murders him. So obviously, kind of the same-sex kiss, that's very kind of queer overtones, but I also think that the act of murdering God, who is also like a parental figure, right? It's kind of a big middle finger to, I will not be what you want me to be. I cannot be what you want me to be. I am something different, and I am not able and I am not willing to conform to these impossible standards that you have set for me. So he is very much this kind of fallen angel. Going back, to the Frankenstein idea, Tyrell is obviously not his family, right? Roy has his family and other replicants, other people or robots, I guess, who are like him. He has Pris, who is his lover, and they're meant to be kind of a foil to Deckard and Rachael. A much healthier relationship that is built on kind of taking care of each other. There's a kind of I think there's kind of a parallel here to, the kind of found family that James Whale and also Mary Shelley create very briefly in Frankenstein. And in the film, it's Bride of Frankenstein, but James Whale was a queer director who put in a lot of queer themes, even in a Hays Code era film. So we have the creature, and the hermit, and they attempt to go domestic for a little bit. Roy and Pris end up kind of camping out with this genetic designer Sebastian for a bit. And there is this sense of solidarity that the replicants have with Sebastian because his body is also breaking down. He has this degenerative genetic disease that makes him age faster than normal. So he's 25 in the film. He looks about 45. So there's this kind of queer solidarity, disabled solidarity, right? Intersectionality. But going back to the fallen angel imagery and symbolism for a bit, I want to think about how Roy introduces himself. So here's a very short little moment.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of oak.
So it's very creepy. It's very kind of ominous. Roy is actually misquoting a poem that was originally written by William Blake all the way in the late 1790s. America, a Prophecy. And it follows this character Orc, who is also, a satanic figure, a demonic figure who goes up against this godlike figure who represents reason and industry and capitalism. And Orc basically burns it all down. There's this kind of positive apocalypse. There's this restorative apocalypse where we burn it all down and we start from scratch and we try to do better the next time. And what's interesting about Orc, many things, but for this talk, he's a binary breaker. He's definitely demonic, but he's also a savior figure, right? He's trying to fix things. He's trying to clear ground. So this binary between heaven and hell has been breached by this character who's doing a little bit of both. Very much like Roy does, actually. Blake, he was pretty weird. He was kind of a maverick. And he was very interested in breaking binaries himself. You know, he wrote this manifesto, this wild Lynchian manifesto, called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And he's, you know, thinking about how he wants to categorize good and evil, right? He says good is the passive that obeys reason, evil is the active springing from energy. Then he says good is heaven, evil is hell, but that gets a little bit confusing, right? Because there's not much good in passivity, right? There's not much good in following orders. That's the kind of lesson that Rick Deckard teaches us, right? Roy, when he meets up with Deckard, he's kind of taunting him. He says, I thought you were supposed to be the good man. Aren't you the good man? Right? Challenging Deckard's obedience to the status quo. And Roy is obviously very much a man of action. He is all energy all the time. So, you know, Rutger Hauer in an interview, he's, you know, he rightfully categorizes Deckard as burnt out and lost due to the nature of his job and the, you know, the emotional toll that takes. And then, you know, enter Roy and he says, I have a few human ideas here. Let me check them out. He keeps testing Deckard on those. And I love the way that Hauer uses this adjective, or not adjective, verb, testing, because Deckard, right, was the one wielding the test to determine if someone was human enough or not, if someone had the right amount of empathy or not. But it's a very passive process, right? You sit down and you answer the questions. How are we supposed to tell, right? Roy's tests are much more action oriented and they are much more immediate because he's doing this in his last moments of life. I know with a lot of, you know, queer or queer coded characters, they are kind of given this unfair burden, right, of having to change the hearts and minds of the straight characters who just don't understand. The question of, is Roy here to do that, right? Is he here just to save Deckard? I don't think so. Roy definitely has his own storyline, and he doesn't meet up with Deckard until the very end. And at that point, you know, he knows he doesn't have much time left. His clock is running out. And I think what Roy is trying to do here is he's trying to leave some kind of legacy. He wants to be sure that he'll be remembered. And Deckard is, you know, the man he's decided who will bear witness to Roy and his energy and will, you know, bear his legacy. I really love this quote. This is from Jane Schoenbrun, who is a new voice in queer horror. She's a trans director. She recently did a film called We're All Going to the World's Fair, which I highly, highly recommend. And she's talking about the queerness inherent in this relationship between, you know, wanting to express yourself creatively, but also bearing the knowledge that the stuff you want to express is not necessarily pretty in the traditional heteronormative sense of the word, which in some cases can lead to a lot of shame and insecurity, right? But I think in the case of Roy, you know, he is always 100% himself. There is a breaking down of the binary between authentic and artificial or performative, right? Roy's very existence really challenges Deckard too, in the words of Buchotman. Again, Deckard wants to preserve the real, whatever that real may be, right? When Roy calls Deckard a good man, it's sarcastic, it's challenging, but it's also implying that the only way Deckard can be considered good is because he's human, is because he's just on the right side of the binary, the right side of the binary. And Roy is attempting to change that. The way that he moves and he acts is very transgressive. He puts on this, again, to quote Buchotman, this performance of self. So I am going to play this clip. I'm going to play a few minutes of it. It's Rutger Hauer is a gift. There's a lot going on, right, with this performance. Roy is kind of threatening Deckard, you know, threatening his masculinity, saying, you know, you better get it up or I'm going to have to kill you, right? He makes a lot of these kind of thinly veiled innuendo type threats to Deckard. He's, you know, obviously almost nude, whereas Deckard is very buttoned up and he's still wearing that heavy coat. But more interestingly, I think Roy is kind of doing a lot of things with physical transgression, right, of the building itself. The building is decaying, it's condemned, and I think that's almost like mirroring Roy's kind of decaying self. But he's, bashing his head through walls. He's, he's got his head kind of half in, half out of a window. The way he moves through the building is there's no regard for kind of normative movement. And he's encouraging Deckard to do the same, right? We see Deckard climbing on top of furniture to get a better sense of where Roy might be. He's poking his head, through the rotting ceiling and up through the floor of the next level. Right. I think Deckard and Batty are both men of violence. They both understand violence. It's a language both of them speak fluently. And so Roy is using violence to kind of reach this mutual understanding. And in doing so, he is forcing Deckard, one, to kind of have empathy for this sense of what it means to be hunted, what it means to be fearing for your life. But also he's encouraging Deckard to, take place on a little bit of transgression of his own. Right. Oh, not again. The kind of final binary that Roy breaks is quite possibly the biggest one he could think to break, which is heaven and hell itself, right? Obviously we see him categorized as this fallen angel, this demon of sorts. But then, in that clip I showed you, we see him stick the nail through his hand. In universe, it's to, send a jolt of adrenaline through his dying body, but also it's a very clear allusion to Jesus, to the stigmata. Which is further backed up by the fact that, at the very end, Deckard is about to fall off of the building, and Roy, in a very impulsive moment, catches Deckard before he can fall. And the hand he catches Deckard with is the one with the nail through it. So it's a very human moment in that we have, someone helping someone else out, this moment of empathy, I guess. But also, it's a very inhuman moment in that Roy is, inhumanly strong. He's using that replicant strength to save Deckard, and he's doing so with, a wounded part of his body, no less. So I wanted to kind of think about a little bit about this, other Blake quote, again, from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, but he, is characterizing Christ as someone who was all virtue because he acts from impulse and not from rules. There's no, he puts no stock in the binary, in any sort of binary. Or the rules that, humans create for themselves. So, so Roy is essentially Deckard's worst nightmare, but also his redeemer. He can be both. And, in saving Deckard, Roy not only shows Deckard what it means to be alive, to be human, to have empathy for the other, but he also encourages some of Deckard's own, transgressions. So when Deckard returns back to his house, his apartment, Rachael is there waiting for him, and he asks Rachael, do you love me? And Rachael says yes. And then he asks Rachael, do you trust me? And she says yes. So we can see that he has a deeper respect for what she's gone through. He has a deeper respect for her as a person, someone who is worthy of having personhood. And he's respectful of her boundaries. And then they leave the city together because it is not safe for either of them. Deckard has had enough. And so I think, even though there's a lot of uncertainty in their future, this is ultimately a positive ending because they have both kind of broken free from the systems that were holding them in place. And they really couldn't have done it without Roy, being himself and putting on this performance that is as human as a performance I've ever seen. So, that concludes that. Thank y'all for bearing with me, for listening to me. This is a fun little slide because all I do these days is just read queer crime fiction and watch queer crime films. It's thesis research. So these are some of my favorites. Here's some of my social, media information if you want to follow me. Here's all my sources, just, being a good scholar. But yeah, thank you guys so much for your attention, and thank you for being out so late. I don't think I could do this. So I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna come back.